Now, having looked at the textual data and the various models employed for understanding it, let us turn to the new archaeological data and toward the possibilities for a synthesis, looking at the material that is accumulated precisely in the last 10 years. We must now bring the story right up to date. First, by sketching this rich new archaeological data, which was not available to Gottwald just a few years ago, and then by outlining the shape this new synthesis may take. First of all, there are recent archaeological data from fieldwork, from excavations of the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Now, we cannot summarize all of this vast evidence here. In the lecture to be published, I have reduced this to several rather complex charts, bringing together the bulk of all the material we know from all the sites in Palestine from the 13th and 12th centuries BC. I can try to summarize that briefly, however, by pointing out these facts. First of all, of a total of some 16 sites clearly said to have been destroyed by the Bible, only 3 have produced any archaeological evidence for a destruction around 1200: Bethel, Lachish, and Hatzor. This is virtually the same archaeological evidence adduced by Albright and Wright a generation ago. We can only add the newer data from Lachish for lowering Albright's 1230 date to around 1175 on the basis of new evidence. Of the remaining 13 sites that are not destroyed, 7 claimed by the Bible as Israelite destructions either were not even occupied in the period, or they show no trace whatsoever of a destruction. Finally, for 6 of these 16 sites mentioned in the Bible, archaeology is simply silent. They have not been positively located, or they have not been excavated sufficiently to yield any evidence. Second, if we look at the picture the other way around, of some 11 sites said by the Bible not to have been destroyed by the Israelites, mostly those listed in Judges 1, 5 have been excavated and indeed show no destruction around 1200. The other 6 have not been dug, or they have produced evidence that is inconclusive. Finally, there are at least 13 other late Bronze and Iron I sites in Palestine of this horizon, either unidentified or not mentioned by the Bible. And of these, 6 were destroyed, in all likelihood by the Philistines or Sea Peoples, and 1 by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah. The other 6 were destroyed by unknown agents, perhaps 1 or 2 by the Israelites, although there's no biblical tradition to that effect, and we have no way of ascertaining archaeologically. In conclusion, it may be stated confidently that the archaeological evidence today is overwhelmingly against the classical conquest model of Israelite origins as envisioned in the book of Joshua and in much biblical scholarship until recently. Many late Bronze Iron Age sites were not destroyed at all, and of those that were, more must be attributed to the Philistines or to unknown causes than to any groups that we might identify as Israelite. On the other hand, there is virtually no archaeological support for the peaceful infiltration or nomadic schools either. There is nothing whatsoever in the archaeological record to suggest that any elements in the Iron I population of Palestine, except of course the Philistines, ever had a pastoral nomadic background or came from outside of Palestine. As we shall now see, the peasants' revolt model, which we treated most recently, and the accounts of the book of Judges, these fare much better in the light of both the recent archaeological discoveries and textual analysis. Now I want to turn briefly to and to illustrate some discoveries of new Iron I sites of the 12th and 11th century. In the last decade or so, American and Israeli archaeologists have suddenly brought to light evidence far more exciting and instructive than the presence or absence of late Bronze destruction layers at the major tells or mounds of Palestine. This consists of the discovery and excavation of at least a dozen one-period sites that we may regard as early Israelite villages of the 12th and 11th century BC, the first such evidence we have had. All of the material I will now illustrate in the slides is largely unpublished, but we can clarify the general picture on the basis of preliminary reports. First of all, let us look at the site of Ai. In the late 1960s and early 70s, J.A. Calloway excavated the small hilltop village of Et Tel, biblical Ai, 10 miles north-northeast of Jerusalem near Bethel. Although, as we have already noted, there were absolutely no late Bronze Age Canaanite remains of occupation at the site, Calloway did find a small 12th, 11th century Israelite village. Unwalled, this village consisted of some 24-room pillared courtyard houses of a type often characterized as Israelite, each possessing 1 or more rock-hewn cisterns. Callaway thus estimates that Ai had a population of about 150, but if there remain any other unexcavated houses of the type seen here that would have filled the entire area, there could have been a population of as much as 300 or so. The pottery repertoire at Ai was limited and consisted mostly of cooking pots, a distinctive store jar called a collar rim jar, and other vessels derived from late Bronze Age Canaanite types of the late 13th century. One house produced a metalworking hearth with a bronze chisel and a dagger. The two brief phases of occupation came to an end with some evidence of a destruction about 1050 BC, or roughly during the rise of Saul at the beginning of the United Monarchy. The second site we turn to is Khirbet Radana. Between 1969 and the middle 70s, Callaway and his colleague Robert Cooley then cleared another similar unfortified village at Khirbet Radana, just on the outskirts of Ramallah, north of Jerusalem, possibly to be identified with biblical Beeroth. Here, there were only 6 courtyard houses, each with one or more cisterns arranged around a number of open work and storage areas, some with hearth and silos. The size and arrangement would suggest a tiny hamlet occupied by an extended family or small clan of perhaps 30 to 40 people subsisting on herding and terrace farming. The pottery was nearly identical to that of Ai, but perhaps closer to late 13th century BC styles. One vessel was a peculiar trick bowl with 20 handles and bullhead spouts at the rim. Here, too, there was evidence for cottage industry in the form of several bronze implements, including an axe. The most significant object was a jar handle inscribed in Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Hebrew letters and reading Achilud, a personal name from the period of the Judges, known also from the Hebrew Bible. Here at Radana, there were 2 phases of occupation, the site apparently having been partly destroyed and abandoned about the mid-11th century BC. The third site we shall look at is Tel Massas. In 1972 to 75, German and Israeli archaeologists cleared another small Iron One village, this time in the northern Negev, 7 miles northeast of Beersheba. Tel Massas is possibly to be identified with biblical Hormah. Here, the first of the 3 strata was fortunately well dated by a scarab of Seti II around 1198 to 1192 BC. The 15-acre village was founded on the relatively rich loessl soil of this rolling region of the low hills, the biblical Negev. The earliest occupation, stratum 3, consisting first only of squatter dwellings, then later of flimsy courtyard houses, had rather poor early Iron Age pottery and storage pits. It was evidently Israelite. It began just before about 1200 and ended in the destruction perhaps around 1100 BC, when better 4-room houses were built and much finer pottery was made, including northern imports and both painted and Philistine Midianite wares. Here one sees the typical 4-room houses that are characteristic of this and so many other early Israelite settlements. And here we see the imported pottery from the north of the country along the coastal region, as well as another view of the scarab. Stratum 1 was then founded and lasted until a final destruction about 975 BC. Of primary importance here is the fact that Tel Massas 3 is probably the small, unwalled early village of Hormah. Its inhabitants were newcomers, at least to this region. They may have been pastoral nomads settling down, for the animal bones retrieved show how they herded sheep and goat and cattle for a livelihood. But the villagers were in contact with local Canaanite culture, as both pottery and house forms indicate. Yet the site is not built on or anywhere near a late Bronze Age destroyed city, as Numbers 23:1-3 implies, but was rather founded peacefully in the open countryside on virgin soil. The site was large enough for as many as 130 houses, and this would yield a maximum population estimate of up to 900. Yet a figure of even half that seems much too high to me. The next site we shall look at is called Izbit Sarta. In 1976 to 1978, the Israeli archaeologists Moshe Kohavi, Israel Finkelstein, and others excavated almost completely the site of Izbit Sarta, clearly to be identified as biblical Ebenezer. The site is located 2 miles east of the large Middle and Late Bronze mound of Afek, at the northern periphery of the Shephelah and Philistine plain, just in the buffer zone at the juncture with the foothills. Stratum 3, extending from about 1200 to about 1150 BC, yielded a picture of several crude courtyard houses with silos inside a perimeter wall. Stratum 2, occupied very briefly around 1025 BC after a century or so gap, produced a fine four-room house with numerous stone-lined silos. In one of the silos, seen here, was found an ostracan, or painted potsherd, written in the Proto-Canaanite script of about 1200 BC. It is a 5-line abecedery, or schoolboy's practice text, in which the young man is trying to make the letters of the alphabet. But the fact that some are backwards, some are out of order, and some are crudely made shows that he possibly flunked this take-home exam. Stratum 1, then, represents a final brief occupation around 1000 to 950 BC, early in the Israelite monarchy. Here, several facts are significant. 1, the site's location near a large Canaanite town, with a distinctively different social structure, however, and an agrarian economy. The progression in the 11th and 12th centuries from herding to intensive agriculture and from poor to better housing, and the evidence in the ostracan of both continuity with Canaanite culture and widespread literacy in early Hebrew society. In Finkelstein's view, the early Israelite settlers at Ebenezer were formerly pastoral nomads migrating from the east, possibly to be identified with the house of Joseph of the Hebrew Bible. It must be stressed, however, that there is no material evidence of such migrations, and indeed the Izbit Sarta pottery is virtually identical to that we have excavated at nearby Gezer, which is certainly not Israelite in the 12th and 11th century, according to both archaeology and the biblical tradition. Our last village site is Gilo, 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem, near Bethlehem, excavated in 1978 and 79 by Amichai Mazar. This is a tiny fortified hilltop site, possibly biblical Baal Perazim, with only fragmentary remains of a few courtyard houses. The pottery, however, is the most extensively published thus far from one of these early Israelite villages. It is clearly transitional, late Bronze Iron I pottery, and can be dated precisely to about 1200 BC. Here we see examples of the typical so-called Israelite collar rim store jar we've spoken of before. The pottery is demonstrably in the late Bronze Canaanite tradition, but there are a few new elements that clearly would place this pottery in the early Iron I tradition. This does not necessarily mean, however, that the inhabitants of Gilo were pastoral nomads settling down, much less newcomers to central Palestine. Mazar's analyses, the best balanced and most authoritative statement yet by an archaeologist, concludes with this very sensible statement. Archaeology can provide positive evidence for the phase of establishing new sites in regions previously unsettled, but it cannot supply evidence for a possible nomadic phase which may have preceded the settlement. It gives a clue to the destruction of some major Canaanite cities, which probably happened as a result of military conflicts between the Israelites and the Canaanite population, yet it cannot be taken as proof of a total monolithic conquest. Thus, the variety of the archaeological finds illustrates the complex process of the Israelite conquest and settlement. Now I want to turn briefly to some topographical surveys which have brought incredibly important new information. In addition to these new one-period sites in central Palestine, Israeli archaeologists in the last decade or so have been concentrating also on region-by-region topographical surveys. And these surveys have turned up hundreds of new Iron I sites, many of them probably first founded by the Israelites. These surface surveys actually began with Aharoni's work in the 1950s in Upper Galilee, which we have already noted. The Institute of Archaeology of the Tel Aviv University, founded by Aharoni in 1968, has continued these surveys, first in the Negev, then later in the coastal plain and into Lower Galilee, and then finally after 1967 in the West Bank, or the occupied territories. In the latter region, in the heartland of ancient Ephraim and Manasseh, the unpublished surveys of Israel Finkelstein and Adam Zertal are especially important. Finkelstein, for instance, has discovered no less than 409 sites to the east of Izbit Sarta, up as far as the Jerusalem hills, of which more than 75 were founded in the 12th century. In the Central Hill Country overall, recent surveys have shown, according to Lawrence Steger, that the number and density of permanent settlements increased dramatically just after 1200 BC. From 23 late bronze sites to 114 Iron I sites, 97 of these founded first in the Iron I period. The individual late bronze settlements were larger than those of the Iron I, but the total occupied area was somewhat smaller. This kind of situation, demographers would suggest, is not attributable to natural increase alone, but must suggest the infiltration of new people into the terraced hill country of Palestine. From the foregoing, it is obvious that there is a sizable influx of new people into the highland zone of Canaan beginning in the early 12th century BC. We may, I think, tentatively identify these newcomers as Israelites, as indeed a few archaeologists and biblical historians have already suggested. But can we offer any tangible evidence for this identification on which so much rests? That is, can we recognize Israelite ethnicity in the archaeological record? Who were these early Israelites, and where did they come from? May we move now at the close toward a synthesis. Here, I think, are some of the general implications of the newer data. Although, of course, we can only draw a provisional picture of the distinguishing characteristics of what may be called early Israelite society. First of all, the typical sites are mostly in the hills of central Palestine. Just on destroyed late bronze sites here and there, but for the most part founded de novo in the early 12th century BC. Most are small, unwalled villages characterized by these early four-room courtyard houses, by rock-hewn cisterns and silos, typical characteristics of the material culture of agrarian or peasant societies. The economy is based on small-scale terrace farming, with some herding of livestock and primitive cottage industries, but also with some evidence for trade with the more distant urban centers. The social structure, unlike that of the urban late Bronze Age, appears to be egalitarian in the extreme, although there is certainly evidence for fairly widespread literacy. Here we see the kind of house plans we have looked at earlier, on the basis of which we can reconstruct something of the size and complexity of family groups. The pottery, however, in contrast to the newly introduced house forms, distinctive socioeconomic structure and settlement patterns, is solidly in the late Bronze Canaanite tradition. Nearly all forms exhibit only the expected normal development from the 13th into the 12th century. And finally, there is no evidence whatsoever in the material culture to suggest that the Israelites originated outside Palestine, or that more than an insignificant number of them came from a pastoral nomadic background. Finally, most of these early Iron I sites were abandoned by the end of the 11th century BC or before, with the growth of a more concentrated urban population at the beginning of the monarchy. The inescapable conclusion, only likely to be enhanced by future archaeological research, is that the Israelite settlement of Canaan, part of the larger transition from the late Bronze to the Iron Age, was a gradual, exceedingly complex process. It involved social, economic, and political, as well as religious changes, with many regional variations. If this is so, then recent archaeological discoveries are most compatible with the peasants' revolt model, although, of course, they cannot prove this model. It is only a working hypothesis. It must be stressed that in the light of archaeology today, it is the late Bronze Iron I continuity, not the discontinuity, that is striking, and the more so as research progresses. In other words, of the two biblical accounts, that in Joshua and in Judges, the latter is by far the more realistic and thus the more historically reliable, because it relates the emergence of Israel to the actual normal process of social and economic change, a process that we can document in Palestine elsewhere on this horizon. And also, the book of Judges' frank recognition of syncretism in early Israelite religion, of the pervasive influence of the old fertility cults of Canaan, a topic we shall return to in the last lecture, instills further confidence in this account. In human terms, we must conclude that it was not so much in a supra-historical ideology that Israel was born, but in the actual daily life-or-death conflict with Canaanite religion and culture. Yahwism was not handed down from heaven to Moses, an immutable spiritual ideal. It was worked out in bitter experience on the soil of Canaan, in constant tension and dialogue with Israel's pagan neighbors. The surprising thing is that Israel survived, and indeed finally eclipsed the long-established and sophisticated cultures of Canaan, both materially and spiritually. In the end, the peasants triumphed and are remembered still for their struggle, while their overlords vanished and are forgotten. Now, on Israelite ethnicity, we still have not managed to specify just how the ancient Israelites were different culturally, the question already raised concerning how archaeological evidence may define ethnicity. The material culture of the early Israelite highland villages sketched above exhibits the following cultural traits. First, four-room houses. Second, early iron implements and technology. Third, collar-rimmed store jars and a few other distinctive ceramic forms. Fourth, developed terrace farming. Fifth, stone storage silos. Sixth, plastered cisterns. Seventh, distinctive bench-style tombs. Eighth, open-air small shrines rather than monumental temples. Now, while these features may indeed be typical of Israelite sites so-called in the 12th century, they're not exclusively so, nor are they necessarily Israelite innovations as often thought. Many of these characteristics are now found in non-Israelite sites, such as those sites in Transjordan being excavated today, and in earlier contexts going well back into the late Bronze Age. It appears, rather, that the distinctive combination of these elements is not so much Israelite as it is a diagnostic feature of the early Iron Age cultures of Palestine generally, and particularly, and we stress this, particularly in the rural areas. More significant, however, than individual traits are such overall cultural factors as these: settlement patterns, economic structure, social organization of Israelite highland villages. One of the most promising applications of the new archaeology to the Israelite settlement horizon is that of Lawrence Steger of the University of Chicago, who utilizes the recent excavations and surveys discussed above, plus the biblical text, together with studies of settlement patterns, house forms, demography, technology, economy, and ethnography. Steger's very sophisticated interdisciplinary analysis has demonstrated that the small architectural units, the agrarian economy, and the egalitarian social structure can be directly related to biblical descriptions of tribal life in the period of the Judges. In text in Joshua and Judges, there are numerous architectural terms that, when re-examined in the light of archaeology today, can be connected to actual buildings that we now have. More important, the individual iron one courtyard house, a typical peasant farmhouse, can be related to the biblical Bet Av, usually translated literally, house of my father, but it is clear that in sociological terms it refers to a descent group or a nuclear family. And the clusters of these houses that we have seen in certain of the plans of the sites then reflects the biblical mishpacha, usually translated simply as family, but we can now see that it is to be understood rather as an extended or multiple family. Thus, Steger concludes that these early Iron One highland sites are Israelite kin-based villages of precisely the type described in the Bible. This approach yields, it seems to me, the best evidence we have yet had that the new archaeology can deal with the difficult problem of ethnicity. We can now begin to say specifically how Israelites differed from Canaanites in their material culture and their social organization, and yet at the same time we may stress the continuity that is increasingly clear in the archaeological record. Now, although archaeology may be successful in recognizing what are called the material correlates of human behavior and social organization, it reaches its limitations when it comes to ideology. Archaeology has not yet, and probably cannot, comment on the political or religious motivations behind the emergence of ancient Israel. We may tend to agree with Gottwald and others that Yahwism, whether a revolutionary social movement or not, was probably the driving force. But we cannot define Yahwism archaeologically beyond describing religious practices, which we shall attempt to do in the last lecture. We can only say that in the cultural vacuum following the collapse of Canaanite society in the 12th century BC, there arose in central Palestine a new ethnic consciousness and solidarity and polity. The emergence of this ethnicity need not have been accompanied by a revolt at all. It may be viewed rather as simply a normal and even predictable historical development in the evolution of complex society. Archaeology can provide an ecology in which social and economic changes become explicable. but it cannot explain the ultimate derivation of that change. Now, in conclusion, we began with the phenomenon of the emergence of Israel and Canaan around 1200 BC, which, although the very foundation of biblical history and religion, was absolutely unattested outside the Bible until 100 years ago. Now, what can we conclude? First, certainly archaeology has illuminated the settlement process brilliantly through both textual and artifactual discoveries, but not in the way that the earlier biblical archaeologists had expected. Rather than simply confirming an Israelite military conquest of Canaan under Joshua or documenting the sedimentation of incoming nomads from the desert, archaeology has forced us to look at a totally new way of viewing early Israel. The admittedly radical view of Israel as a peasants' revolt in Gottwald and a number of other contemporary biblical scholars has, in my mind, been powerfully buttressed by the new interdisciplinary archaeology, so much so that we have undoubtedly reached a crucial turning point in scholarship in these areas. Now, if this view is correct, then there was no statistically significant conquest of Palestine at all. Perhaps only the house of Joseph, or the tribe of Joseph, was ever in Egypt. The other tribes of Israel were probably local Canaanite groups, like the Gibeonites and the Shechemites, who joined the Israelite tribal confederation by covenant and thus became Yahwists. There was of necessity some armed conflict with the Canaanite city-states, but for the most part we are dealing, it seems, with an ideological revolution. Second, must we conclude then that the Bible was wrong? That at least the Pentateuch and the book of Joshua have no historical basis? Not necessarily. As scholars have long known, this lengthy epic narrative, the major part of the Deuteronomic mystic history, was not compiled until the 7th century BC. And the version that we now have in the Hebrew Bible did not take final form before the time of the return from the exile in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. The Deuteronomic historiography was obviously a late theological construct which deliberately overemphasized the themes of the Exodus from Egypt, the holy war against Canaan, the covenant. All of these were extensions of the promised land motif of that document. Nevertheless, the Deuteronomists did preserve earlier materials with alternate views, fortunately, such as the portions we have quoted of the book of Judges. What recent research has done is simply to rescue and to re-emphasize one neglected strand of the complex biblical narratives concerning Israel's origins. The real contribution of modern archaeology has been to provide for the first time, alongside the theological explanation, an overall sociological setting in which we now find it possible to understand the settlement process in a new light. Now, the biblical writers were aware of the social setting, of course, but they were much more concerned with viewing history as what we discussed in the first lecture, the Magnalia Dei, the mighty acts of God. For us moderns, however, who have known so many peasants' revolts in the 20th century, the current sociological model may be more interesting and more relevant because it leads to a greater comprehension of ancient Israel in all of its diversity and vitality, as well as a more profound appreciation of its dynamic relation to Canaanite religion and culture. Finally, the new stress on the humanity of Israel need not depreciate the divine element, that is, faith. Ultimately, the biblical writers faced the same problem we do: how to account for the unique reality of the people of Israel. They fell back on the only analogy they had available, historical experience, which for them was their own first-hand knowledge of the power of Yahweh, the God of Israel, over their pagan neighbors, and his ability to save and shape them as his people, despite their obscure origins, their lack of merit, and their disobedience. In the end, the biblical writers concluded that Israel's election and survival were nothing less than a miracle. And who are we, their modern spiritual heirs, to disagree?